Greetings, everyone. I'm Joseph Attic, Executive Chairman of ID for Africa, and I'd like to welcome you all to this very special LiveCast episode, which we bring to you, as always, in English and French. Si vous voulez écouter cette émission en français, veuillez choisir le canal français pour la traduction simultanée. Before we start, please do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the fresh content that we will be bringing to you throughout the year. Today is September 16, a very special day for the identity community. So I'd like to wish everyone happy Identity Day. Coming up, we will have a very exciting program with many segments and features. But before we jump into it, I'd like to share with you a commemorative message from the ID for Africa creative team.
Can you imagine a world where you officially don't exist? A world where you can't travel because you don't have a passport? A world in crisis where you can't get aid because you don't have an ID card? A world where you don't have an identity because you don't have a birth certificate? That world exists for more than 500 million Africans today. Because identity mattered, ID for Africa was born in 2014. We started in Tanzania, and since then we've been advocating throughout Africa. We built one of the strongest identity communities in the world. Our purpose is to make the invisibles visible. So 2 years ago, we pushed for an agenda
to recognize September 16 as International Identity Day.
Since then, over 120 international organizations pledged support to the Identity Day Coalition. Nigeria now officially observes ID Day. The rest of the world also joined in the celebrations. But then the pandemic happened. COVID disrupted our lives. Some are responding through fear. Others are seeing the historical context of how this pandemic is changing society. It marks a new time in history, and living with COVID has become the new normal. While this has become painful for everyone, we as the identity community are fortunate to have an important mission to accomplish in these difficult times. And we cannot afford to be nostalgic or indecisive, for time is not on our side. COVID has thrust upon us the responsibility of making the invisibles visible quickly, so they can be counted and helped by their governments as the economic woes deepen, and the need for public assistance makes the difference between life and death. Never before have the words "leaving no one behind" been more relevant than today. This is the rallying cry that is uniting our community in the face of this devastating menace. On September 16, we reaffirm our commitment to making the invisibles visible. The ID for Africa family wishes you a happy and inclusive International Identity Day. And because identity matters now more than ever before, join us.
So why call for a commemorative day for identity? As you may know, many important causes have an observance day. December 10 is Human Rights Day. June 20th is Refugee Day. Even tuna has an International Observance Day. If you know what that day is, you're either a trivia champion or work for the fishing industry. But kidding aside, don't you think it's time for identity to have an observance day? Identity has become one of the most important assets that a human can possess. Without it, we cannot function in society. We believe recognizing September 16 as Identity Day is an effective and practical way to raise awareness and generate momentum around the importance of identity. And the COVID pandemic has made it clear that identity matters even more than ever before. So on this day, we need to reaffirm our commitment to push for the recognition of Identity Day until the majority of countries in the world officially recognize and celebrate it. One country that's doing this is Nigeria. They have reaffirmed their commitment yesterday at the highest political level And we are happy to welcome today a special guest on the program, DJ Aziz from NIMSI, who will tell us briefly what is happening in Nigeria around this issue. Hello, DJ Aziz, how are you? Welcome.
Fine, thank you, and greetings to the family of ID for Africa. Today we join the coalition of ID partners and stakeholders to mark the second edition anniversary of the National ID Day. This event started yesterday, but the virtual National ID Day celebration happened today, of course, due to the COVID. And we started early in the morning with a morning show on television, and we had a lot of radio programs and distribution of a booklet that we produced for the commemoration of the day. But the most important aspect is that our president, our dear president, Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR, in his address yesterday to the nation, enjoined the world community and the United Nations to adopt 16th September as International ID Day to raise awareness and push actions on the importance of achieving legal identity for all by year 2030 as encoded in the SDG goals 16.9. The awareness and sensitization focuses on the role of identity in human life and existence, significance of the National ID Day, and the campaign for global adoption and observance of the International ID Day. The federal government of Nigeria, the NIMSI governing board, management and staff, and all ID stakeholders and partners joined us virtually as Nigeria marked the second anniversary of the National Identity Day. But in his remarks to the nation, our news supervisor and also the digital economy champion, the Honorable Minister of Communications and Digital Economy, Dr. Isa Ali Ibrahim Pantami, reminded Nigerians on the importance of the digital identity, adding that the ministry is developing the right policy environment to support enrollment for digital IDs with the ecosystem approach in the country. And I quote the minister, we will start by capturing internally displaced persons in Nigeria, and we'll also support NIMSI and other stakeholders to ensure we make the process of obtaining digital identities swift and secure. He explained that digital identification can be an important catalyst for various development initiatives in the continent, such as impacting on trade, governance, social protection, financial inclusion, domestic resource mobilization, as well as the security and human rights. Finally, he urged Nigerians to visit NIMSI accredited centers for their digital identities, and it will help the development of a digital economy. So I'll close by saying happy ID Day to all my ID for Africa family. And as we move towards other programs, I wish you success. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, DJ Aziz. Thanks for having us. I know you've had a very busy schedule today. I want to remind everyone that we will be holding a unique event next week. We'll be actually launching the country progress reports with a spotlight on Nigeria. This is a new series where the identity stakeholders in the country are united on a roundtable to discuss how they work together, the challenges they face, and how they each contribute to the development of the country's harmonized identity ecosystem. This promises to be a very intense and informative session, and it's happening at a time when a lot of progress and changes are being made in Nigeria, as DJ Aziz just mentioned. This type of session has never been done before, so please don't miss it. Go to our LiveCast page and register for the event today. Also with us as a special guest today is the president of the IIC, Mori Kamara, with a final goodwill message before we start this session. Mori?
Hello, greetings to all. I'm Maury Camara from the Republic of Guinea. I am currently the Managing Director of the National Agency of Electronic Governance and the President of the IIC, the ID for Africa Identity Council. The IIC is the Pan-African body representing all 48 African countries that have designated an ID for Africa ambassador. I wish you all a happy International Identity Day. It is a moment for us as Africans to reflect on the meaning of this day and what actions we need to take. The COVID-19 pandemic is showing us, for example, the importance of identity, legal or digital. Over 500 million people in Africa continue to be without proof of identity, and Identity Day is a reminder of their plight. No proof of identity means no access or very limited access to social services, no ability to travel safely, no ability to fully participate in the real economy of a country, no bank account, no education, no social housing, in so many words, no real integration into society. It is clear that the road to providing 500 million of people with proof of legal identity is hard, but the consequences of doing nothing would be even harder for the entire world. On a good note, many African countries are well on their way to achieve this goal. Some are more advanced than others, but within the IIC, we all benefit from each other's experiences. The IIC allows us to share information, to avoid common pitfalls, and to strive for true Pan-African collaboration and solidarity. So on this day, let us reaffirm our commitment to identity for all across Africa. On behalf of the ID for Africa Identity Council, allow me to once again wish you all a happy International Day. Happy International Identity Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you. And again, thank you all for being with us on this day. In fact, on this special day, we thought we'd take on one of the most important challenges for identity development, and that's the inclusion challenge. Of course, don't take our word for it. Over 24 international development agencies and think tanks identified inclusion as critical to the development agenda, and the top 2 principles in the seminal document called Principles on Identification for Sustainable Development have to do with inclusion. Today, we're delighted to have with us an illustrious panel with over 200 years of collective experience in identity management and economics. I'd like to welcome the panelists. Please bring them on. So with us today, please raise your hand when I identify you, is Alan Gelb from the Center for Global Development from Washington. Tariq Malik from UNDP joining us from New York. Barry Cooper from Senfree joining us, I believe, from Cape Town. Christabel Onyejekwe from NIBS, who's joining us from Abuja, I believe.
Lagos.
Lagos. You're joining us from Lagos. Yes, thank you. And Mustafa Mahmoud from Namati, who is joining us from Nairobi. Ken Okongo, who is joining us, he's from GSMA, and he's joining us from Nairobi. Joan Dubois from Thales, who is joining us from Paris. I have the entire welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to say that the session is going to consist of 3 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about essentially the barriers to inclusion, the origins of exclusion. The second part, we're going to talk about policies, practices, and platforms that have been proven to be effective in alleviating the exclusion problem and improving inclusion. And then at the end, I want to end the session with some real calls for action. So ideas that we can take home, ideas that we can do as the identity community to move this dialogue forward. We have not forgotten about the important contribution of the community voices. So if you're interested in joining the dialogue, please stay pertinent and on topic and raise your hand electronically. An operator from ID for Africa will connect with you, and if selected, will alleviate you, will upgrade you to join the panel and say your contribution. But please stay on topic and stay brief. Before we let the other panelists go, I will say in the beginning, we are going to have a keynote presentation, which is given by Alan Gelb. So Alan will remain on the panel. The panelists will come back after the keynote, and we will engage in continued dialogue with each panelist participating with their prepared remarks. So at this stage in time, I ask the panelists, except Alan, to turn their video and stand by to join us again. Alan, I give you the forum, and somebody will be putting up your screen.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And Joseph, it's really a privilege to be here with you and the other participants on this very important day to talk about the problem of inclusion. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Next, please. In the principles, Joseph talked about the principles on identification for sustainable development. And as Joseph said, the first two principles relate to inclusion and exclusion, and they point to the two sides of inclusion. The first is coverage, universal coverage for individuals, and the second is removing barriers to access and usage, because we must remember that the ID is actually an entry point into a whole range of services and benefits. Next, please. Now, we are in a race against time. I think we have to recognize this, because most countries, most societies and economies have made a transition. They've moved from local ID towards centralized ID. And most societies and economies have done that some time ago. But now we're moving towards digital ID and towards digital services. And so that process is a very rapid process of transition. And the ID is increasingly a gateway. It's a gateway into a whole range of participation, services, of being able to operate effectively in a modern state. Thank you. And at the same time, over the last 15 years, we've seen a boom in the number of identification programs, number of national IDs, many of them now with digital elements, and a proliferation of functional programs, ID programs for particular purposes. And so for hundreds of millions of people, the question is going to be, will this ID gateway be open or will it be shut? And this is hundreds of millions of people. And we have seen this very much in terms of the response to the coronavirus, that ID has been the hinge, it has been the entry point for the programs of social assistance that many countries have launched to provide support for their citizens during this very difficult period. Those who have not had ID have generally not been able to access these programs well. Thank you. When we come to exclusion, why do we have exclusion from coverage? And we know that there are many multiple overlapping factors. It's not just one thing. It's often associated with the personal attributes, the features of the person. Poverty, if you're poor, if you're remote, if you're a woman, if you have low education, if you belong to a minority group, if your national status is not clear. All of these together or separately in combination, they increase exclusion. We know that there are supply side constraints, the time and the distance to registration, the costs, the documentation requirements, cultural or language barriers. Sometimes people can't understand the instructions. Poor communication is a very frequent problem. And we know also that there are some demand side constraints, in that there may be poor services or difficulties using the ID which discourage people from applying for it in the first place. And across countries, there are differences, but there are many common factors. These are usually the factors, and they reflect often a failure to adopt a customer-centric approach, the approach of seeing the ID as a service centered around the customer. So, for example, moving on, if we look at the Findex surveys, they show how these combinations of factors, low education, being a woman, being rural, being poor, all of these factors act in combination to create exclusion. And overall, this survey found that about 44% of women living in low-income countries did not have an ID, compared to only 28% of men. And in this survey, 8 of the 10 countries with the largest gender gaps in ID were actually in sub-Saharan Africa. And these groups that are excluded are often the groups that we want most to be included in public services and benefits. So we have a challenge. When we look at registration, next please, we have to think about the incentives. We know that for the users, incentives are very important in terms of the benefits that they can achieve. But also on the provider side, we have to recognize that last mile registration can be costly. And we need to look at the economics of registration. It's far more costly to enroll people in remote areas than it is in the cities. And we need to think about the incentives here, and there are good practices in a number of countries where some functions of registration have been outsourced, or whether there's been allowance for the cost of reaching people. Next, please. Civil registration. Only 45% of children under 5 are registered in sub-Saharan Africa by the age of 5. Globally, 73% are. And the unregistered children are about half the total of people without identification. So we have to strive towards better integration between the ID system and the civil registration system. Also to help continuous registration. We need integration, we also need technology. And here we're seeing the use of mobiles for birth notification, a very important step that can help us bring down costs and reach people. And again, we need to look at the incentives on both the demand and the supply side. And we see examples where, in some cases, the ID system has worked backwards to strengthen the civil registration system, helping to provide technical support and providing incentives to report and register quickly. Next, please. Turning to barriers in use, we also know a lot about these barriers. Information. Often information is poor. People do not understand. They do not know the processes. Capacity constraints. The last mile needs people. It's not just technology. It's the use of intermediaries like NGOs or other agencies to help bridge between the technology and the people. And here again, we have good examples. There are weaknesses in authentication ecosystems when they rely on smart devices that many poor people don't have. No backup processes in cases of technology failure. We see examples of these. Requirements for additional credentials, for example, KYC. And another thing we see is that it makes a difference as to why one introduces identification requirements. We have examples from India where the same ID systems have been introduced into different states. In one case to save money, only to save money, and in the other case for better service. And what do we find? Not surprisingly, when the ID is introduced to save money, people get excluded. When the ID is introduced to improve services, people are included, and actually the state saved money as well because the service was so much better delivered. So there are lessons here for us when we look forward. Next, please. So it's interesting if we look at the two big risks from ID system, exclusion and the erosion of trust. These are very different because the trust issues, the surveillance, the data privacy concern everybody, including the rich and the privileged. These are the people who are concerned. The exclusion affects marginalized people who are less powerful, and we sometimes look at this from a siloed perspective. We need to look at it holistically from a user journey perspective. And I think this is important for the way forward. Finally, thank you. Just to end off, I think it's very important that we monitor exclusion carefully and routinely. We do it sometimes as part of a one-time project assessment, but it's a continuing process, and we should be focusing on both coverage and on use. And each country is different, we know that, but the fact is exclusion is shaped by many common factors, and it's not just the technology, it's the human bridge between the people and the technology that is very, very important. And here again, inputs from CSOs and NGOs can be very important. So let me stop there, Joseph, and again, wish everybody a very happy Identity Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Operator, bring back the panelists. And while you're bringing back the panelists, I want to raise a question for Alan to think about. Alan, the critics of identity systems argue that actually there is a very high risk of discrimination, whether intentional or not intentional, intentional in the sense that marginalized groups or certain ethnic groups could be discriminated against by an ID system, and then therefore resulting in exclusion. And then there's another aspect is that often ID programs that are badly executed result in the opposite of what they were intended to do. Instead of including people, they become barriers to exclude people. So how do you answer critics that say ID programs have an increased risk for exclusion?
Joseph, that's a great question. The first point is, I think we need to, first of all, be very clear on what the counterfactual is. There is a lot of exclusion for reasons unrelated to ID programs. We see that as well. And we have to be honest about that. So there isn't a perfect world out there where everybody is included. Then an ID program comes in and it excludes people. It's not that simple, right? But it is nevertheless true that while the ID programs can help to include, they can also exclude. They can do both. They have both sides to it. So I agree that there is a risk. And it's a risk, for example, as national status, to take one example, as national status is increasingly formalized, there are many people who now participate. They may be on the fringes of society, but they participate, they are anonymous, they are not classified. And once you start bringing that classification in, you run the risk of excluding those people. So there has to be a focus on those issues. The critics have a point in many of these cases that this requires serious look at. The second point is the opposite effect, you know. And again, I think part of it is the surrounding ecosystem in which the ID system is being implemented. I gave you the example from India where we see two states. One is the purpose is only to save money, the other is to improve services. And we need to embed the ID system in a very good feedback system where we are continually feeding back information on who is benefiting, who is being crowded out, and we need action from that feedback. So this is what I think we need to do. We need to take this criticism seriously.
So, I mean, the critics continue to claim that in certain cases, and they mention certain governments, that actually these governments utilize ID systems as part of a deliberate policy to exclude. I mean, how do we ensure that that is not the case? Is there some sort of an international standard that we can impose on any government that's about to launch an ID system to say, look, we're not going to let you use the ID system to discriminate against certain ethnic groups that exist in your country?
This is a very difficult question because countries are sovereign.
Right.
And in some of these areas, and I'm thinking particularly of nationality problems, countries have traditionally had a fair amount of leeway in terms of deciding how to approach them. So
Right.
I don't believe that you can impose. What you can do is you can make transparent. You can make it transparent. You can make it clear. You can look at the network, the whole array of international agreements and conventions, and try to make sure that countries are living up to their own commitments, which is often the problem. Sometimes they have made commitments, but they're not living up to them. And it's a process. And this is where I think the international community needs to be involved and needs to stay involved. That's really the way forward here.
And what about basically linking loans and support, financial support, to certain performance or certain standards? What do you think? Is that an effective way that the international community could use to ensure that programs will not become discriminatory?
I think in some cases, yes. I think in some cases where there is clearly overt discrimination, where the purpose of systems are being brought in clearly for the purpose of exclusion, that those systems should not be supported internationally. But in other cases, I think it may be more productive to have incentives. In other words, incentives where funding and advice is tied towards certain goals of the system, and do it on a results-based system, rather than supporting and funding programs with large block grants. Give incentives for the registration of underrepresented groups. Give incentives for reaching these groups with programs using the ID systems. And I think that would be quite an effective way of doing it.
So you would argue that maybe we can give an incentive for marginalized groups. You would be getting more credit for reaching out to the ones that are marginalized. Would you say, for example, women, they're not showed, if you're able to get rural people, those would be worth twice as you would get in.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
I think we have to recognize that the costs of reaching some of these people are higher.
Right.
And in fact, Joseph, in some of the cash transfer programs now that are going in, right, the payment service providers are being paid graduated fees. They are being paid more if they are in rural areas, recognizing that they have to reach people. It's more costly. So their commission is higher. And I think we should look at that idea and begin to build it into our economic modeling of these systems, because it makes sense.
Okay, great. So let's pause for a second. Just reminding the audience that if you want to join the conversation on an ad hoc basis, raise your hand and we can try to upgrade you to the community voices. Actually, Mustafa from Namati, I know you have something coming up. You're gonna be talking to us about this question. If you have a short teaser to tell us in response to this question of discrimination, go ahead for the teaser. I'll come back to you afterwards.
Okay, it's not in the intention of identity system to discriminate against people, but unfortunately the people who are implementing it have already have professionalized the systemic discrimination for years. And unfortunate bit is that there's a push for digital identity, the new digital identity around the world. But unfortunately, we have not resolved the existing problems of the current identity systems. So by the push to enroll into new identity systems, we are going to further marginalize communities that have been marginalized by the current identity systems. For example, in Kenya, where we have over 5 million people who have to go through differential treatment in terms of application for identity systems, they had a problem of enrollment in the current one. And then now we are going to go to a new digital identity, which the old identity cards are a prerequisite to enroll into a new one. So you see, as much as the intention is not to discriminate further, we have a system that will further marginalize them because they have a prerequisite to enroll to a new system. So, so that's the irony of it. The intention is good, but the implementation is usually the challenge.
Okay, so as a result of a bad implementation, we're seeing a system that is becoming exclusionary. Hold that thought. wanna ask Ken. We'll come back to you because I know you have more to say on this topic. I want to come back to Ken from GSMA. Ken, GSMA does a lot of research on access, on exclusion, on participation, et cetera. Can you tell the audience where can we learn about some of the research studies that you have done on the origins of exclusion or the barriers to inclusion? Have there been any studies that you guys have done on a large scale that would corroborate what Alan has said, and where can we get them?
First of all, thank you, ID for Africa, and on behalf of the GSMA, I want to thank you for inviting us to this forum to share our thoughts on this International Identity Day. It's a privilege and we do not take it for granted. Yeah, indeed, despite the existing strong link to other development outcomes, access to identity has for too long been taken for granted. And this has been brought to the fore with the United Nations SDGs. And then over half of the number that's actually excluded that we talk about of 1 billion, over half of the number reside actually in sub-Saharan Africa. Our mission, first of all, as GSMA Digital Identity, is to leverage mobile technology as an enabler for inclusive and responsive digital identity. And we've worked with the operator members, the mobile network operator members and other partners to research and actually analyze the barriers to this digital identity. We've also gone ahead and explored some sustainable commercial models through pilots that demonstrate how mobile can be leveraged to build inclusive ID ecosystem. So specifically,
we'll come back to that. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I wanted to know if you had studies about the origins of exclusion and the barriers to inclusion, because that's the sort of the topic we want to, afterwards we can talk about platforms and et cetera that could help with the inclusion. Does GSMA have studies on the inclusion?
Yes, I was just trying to build the context. Specifically, we've produced certain research and publications since 2006, and we've documented certain trends that I want to share. And these point to some of the root causes of inclusion that could be spotlighted at this particular time to inform the design of these more inclusive ID frameworks.
Okay.
And some of which are actually in sync with what has been presented here. For example, in 2019, we conducted some qualitative research on digital identity with stakeholders and end users in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we went beyond also in Asia. The countries actually, for example, included Tanzania, Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana, and Ivory Coast. And we found out that ID documents for sure have practical value, but there's a complex narrative, gender-related associated with it. And nearly all research participants asserted that women and men, in as much as they've got equal right to an ID, there are prevailing social norms that reinforce this widely held assumption that women have less practical need for ID compared to men. And this perceived lack of agency has further complicated it for this vulnerable segment of the population, the women and girls. And many women, for example, are unable even to leave their homes to travel long distances to the national registries or even in the enrollment centers. And this is further compounded by the fact that they are even less willing to navigate these lengthy and sometimes and often actually complex enrollment processes. Mm-hmm. And this is just a summary of the key insights from this work. The detailed research is in our 2019 briefing paper titled End User Research, Our Top 5 Lessons, available online. But again, in 2019, we consolidated a range of insights on the unique identity challenges faced by 3 types of urban dwellers. Children, for example, born in the urban areas, the rural urban migrants, and those who've been forcibly displaced, including the internally displaced persons and the refugees. We found out that the unique identity needs of a person living in urban poverty can be influenced by a wide range of factors, one of which is the place of origin. Have they immigrated into the place? The level of education, for example, the digital skills, access to, or even the need to access employment, and overall financial stability of the person or the household. If these are not favorable, there's a possibility that this can lower access to and even use of these official IDs that we're talking about. And this has the potential of even worsening the consequences of ID exclusion. Again, the detailed report of this work is available online somewhere, titled Identity and the Urban Poor. But in summary, our view as a program globally from the various pieces of research that we've conducted is that those in low-income countries are less likely to have access to ID, often for reasons related to outdated paper-based identity systems or schemes, cultural norms, like I've stated about the ones that relate to women and girls, poor communication channels between the rural areas and the identity registry offices, as well as cumbersome registration processes, and even the cost associated with this registration, and lack of awareness of the importance of having this ID. So we've attempted to understand all this, what all this means for the industry, and I'll share further insights when I get time.
Okay, I'll come back to you. What we want to move in now in this part of the discussion into the section where we can share some proven policies, practices, and platforms that we know have led to positive results in the inclusion challenge. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at the big picture first from two countries, maybe Malawi and Pakistan, from Tariq. Then I'm going to go to a very specific sector, which is the financial sector, where there have been policies that have led to improvements in the inclusion, plus identification of policies that are actually detrimental to the inclusion. Then we're going to go to the platforms and try to understand what those would do. So why don't we, of course, anybody from the community that wants to join this discussion, please raise your hand, and operator, please let me know. We'll bring them after Tariq has given his prepared remarks. So Tariq, can I ask you to share with us your experience on what are the policies and practices that you think could help alleviate the inclusion challenge?
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, and happy ID Day to all my colleagues. We are going to discuss the strategy and the policies, and I'll share a few examples from two recent projects that I have done, one in Malawi and before that in Pakistan, of ID implementation. As far as strategy is concerned, you know, there is, it goes without saying that adoption of a well-crafted, deliberate, no one left behind strategy is the key inclusive strategy to ensure universal access to ID system and to hedge against exclusion risk. It may include, among other initiatives specific to the country, updating legal framework to remove barriers such as discriminatory measures, exception handling mechanisms, complaints and redressal systems for citizens, for those without ID, to prevent exclusions to basic rights and services, and minimizing data collection and documentation requirements for registration. Just like, you know, Alan has also pointed towards it, Mustafa, Ken also mentioned, you know, the process of registration, the documentation, and those areas which prevent people to register. One key area that we missed is basically the stress on social contract between the state and the people. And we sometimes tend to forget that ID is the key in building that trust. And unfortunately, discrimination, exclusions are often embedded in national ID schemes in deep political way. We just heard the example of Kenya, and even in Kashmir, you know, Aadhaar is for everybody, but you know, in India, there is no internet for one whole year, and you know, in Kashmir, people are deprived from that. Similarly, state of Assam and other areas also. where the people lack the ID, although the ID is touted as the instrument for all. Now, how did we address it in Malawi? Malawi, we had national level policy and community-based civic education campaign. So 2 campaigns we ran, one national level campaign and the other one is community-based civic education campaigns using NGOs, CSOs, print, electronic, social media. A strategy was developed where there is a CSO, it's called NICE, National Initiative on Civic Education. It was tasked to generate public demand. Using local language, they conducted cultural events to 28 districts with hundreds and thousands of villages within the villages using African dance, drama, folk theater to educate the public. And the public actually found out that what is the value of IT, how it is going to strengthen the social contract. Pakistan used the same strategy. I gave registration targets to NGOs who conducted folklore fairs targeting women and vulnerable communities, which actually spiked the registration demand from 45% in 2009 to 104% in 2012. About 21 million women were registered. So strategy for addressing the cultural norms while onboarding women in areas where, there were cultural norms like control of religious extremists in Pakistan, helped to open up registration offices in remote areas of Pakistan, which increased the enrollment. I remember in a religious extremist controlled area like Taliban, where we were thrown a challenge that men are holding the hands of women to register, to take the biometrics. We ended up opening all women staffed office, 13 of them. And when first of such office opened in Mardan, in the remotest area of Pakistan, 3,000 women on the first day came up and said yes to identity, because they understood that if they can report domestic violence, they can get aid in the times of crisis. If they are displaced, they can count on the government. So these strategies worked very well. Similarly, empowering the people with the identity like transgender. Pakistan is the first Muslim country that issues the card to the transgender where their gender is written. Similarly, if you go to the policies, people and citizens are the key stakeholders of such projects. Hence, the best policy for enrollment or onboarding them is to consult them. Hence, public engagement to collect their valuable input is the key policy. This consultation during the planning phase and throughout implementation is crucial for understanding and mitigating barriers to access and designing ID systems that are user-friendly and solve real problems. Likewise, conducting qualitative and end-user research can help improve the design of ID system from the perspective of people. I could think additionally robust and intensive, information campaigns, as I mentioned, are necessary to educate the public about registration as with easily accessible grievance redressal system. Now, this is very important that the citizen has some where to go to complain if their rights are severed, if they are not able to register themselves. And this is helpful to erode the trust deficit between citizen and the states and the institution involved in onboarding. In Malawi, we tested that. Proof of concept was done before rolling out the overall mass registration phase with built-in lessons learned in that proof of concept. Partnerships with CSO helped also. We conducted surveys within phases to solicit public feedback, and corrective actions were taken. Meeting with all agencies who issue any type of identity instrument or paper which has citizen data revealed that Malawi had some secondary IDs like driver's license, voter ID, health document, electricity utility papers, SIM card, banking cards. Now there was a problem in Malawi that, you know, they didn't have a specific primary ID. So what we did is that we created a scoring model, and we said, okay, if you have a voter ID, you get, let's say, 15 points. If you have driver's license, you get 25 points. If you have passport, you get 40 points. And if you score 100 overall, then, you know, we will register you. So, and it helped to actually create a system which people can trust, and you enrolled the real Malawians in the system. But if you don't have any of these documents, then simple verification from the village head or the you know, registrar of that area district helped it very well. In Pakistan,
Tariq, 1 second. You said the real Malawians. So this program, the registration was linked to the nationality. So what was it in Malawi? Specifically, only Malawians that were registered? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, there were, the program was for everybody, but it was linked to nationality, that you will get an ID card, national ID card for Malawians, a foreign resident card for foreigners,
Okay.
a refugee card for refugees. So there were like 4 or 5 different instruments. Same in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, you know, special policies were approved to reach out to vulnerable segment of the society. For example, I found out as Chairman Nadra that, you know, there were cumbersome processes and the documents which were required to register for minorities. I relaxed the procedure. For example, a baptization certificate from the church, I said it's as good as birth certificate. And it helped to register 1.2 million Christians. Similarly, you know, 1.3 million Hindus were registered. 943 proud Jews families in Pakistan were registered also. So, so on and so forth. So you help to register minorities, and you linked it with the voter registration database, and you find out that you ended up in creating a voter registry which is inclusive of all minorities. And for first time, you know, 2.6 or 3 million minority folks had the right to vote. And there was a study that was done that in every constituency, there are 10,000 votes that makes the decision who wins the election. And there are exactly 10,000 minority votes.
Right.
So this helped the religious parties to go to the minorities also. You know, that's how the
you engage the civil society as partners with you from the beginning to assure, build the trust involved. Just one question, then I'm going to hold you on pause. We'll come back to the platforms. But I want to know, what was the level of inclusion in the Malawi program and the Pakistan program? Where are we right now?
In Pakistan, we have registered 122 million people, and you know, 98% of population is registered. There is a gap, slight gap between male and female registration. We have to do more to register rest of the women. But overall, 98% population is registered. In Malawi, we have 98 and 99% adult population is registered. But here is a very good story of Malawi. There was a folklore that women work a lot and women assert their identity in Malawi. Now we have real data that in each district, 51 to 58% women were registered. So women registration outweigh men registration in Malawi.
Okay. That's excellent. Tariq, thank you so much. I think these are impressive results. I think those experiences, I think they've been written up. They're available. I know that on the Center for Global Development, Alan, there's a beautiful article that talks about some of those experiences. And so we can consult them. I want to pause this for a second because I want to go into another sector, which is fundamentally linked to this question of inclusion, which is the question of financial inclusion. I mean, we talk about identity as a legal right, but in fact, it is a practical necessity. If you don't have access to banking or payment, then you are basically unable to function in society. So I'm going to take a little sidebar because that's a form of inclusion that I think is very, very important. So I want to come to Christabel from NIBS, from Nigeria, to understand sort of their perspective on the sectorial inclusion, which is financial inclusion. What did you do and what was the strategy and what were the results?
Thanks, Joseph, for having me. I think I'm quite excited to be here today. More so, the DG NIMSI just spoke. So I'm joining my fellow Nigerians to say a very big congratulations for having set up September 16th as the ID Day for Nigeria. That's a...
So, Christabel, yes, we're having you
That's
back.
a huge... Okay, great. I'm so sorry about that. That's a huge milestone. And as such, if I'm here today, then of course it's a privilege and an honor to be here on this same day. So to your question, Nigeria, as we all know, it is a 200 million mass population country with huge potentials, both human and material, and a very strong financial services industry. So to propel the financial inclusion statement, this was more enabled by Central Bank of Nigeria, that in the year 2012, it launched the Nigeria National Financial Inclusion Strategy document with KPIs, which included a few but not limited to the following. We had, of course, access, which is the most important discussion, usage, affordability, financial literacy, consumer protection, and then gender, as we all know it, and a lot more. The aim at that time was actually to reduce the percentage of adult population of those who do not have access to financial services. In 2020, to be precise, it was 46.3%, 2010. And then, of course, if you look at that, the whole idea behind the strategy document was to move that to 20% in 2020. So technically put, if you assess Nigeria in the year 2010, it will be said that about 50% of the adult population did not have access to financial services. And that's a tall order. But the same circular was revised in 2018. And by this time, based on the 2-yearly data being produced by FINA, we're able to witness a lot of milestones. And these were predicated on both macro and micro enablers. I will kind of dwell on the micro enablers because of the timing and again, the subject issue. So we'll find that given the elaborate stakeholder involvement, we had to focus on the digital evolution that was happening and some enablers around digital ID. We had to expand our agent network, and we were trying to improve the G2P payments and the P2G payments. This at that time was quite weak. But if you look at what has happened in, I think precisely February 14, 2014, the then CBN governor launched the BVM project, and that was a catalyst in trying to push the identity subject discussion in Nigeria forward. So when you look at this screen, some of the details there, we want to compare Nigeria with other countries, countries that appear like ourselves in terms of population. You have Brazil, Uganda, Tanzania, and India. When you look at the financial inclusion rate of India, for instance, you can see that they have achieved 81%. And clearly for Uganda, which is an African state, achieved 85%. And this, I think, compared to Nigeria, we're currently, and this is 2018 data, on 63.2%. This particularly, we are not happy with, and the whole idea was to reduce this or to keep improving this as much as possible. We just heard from Malawi talk about 98% identity registration, and I'm sure that's where a lot of countries would like to be. So, but we had to look at some riders. So for agents, for instance, in Brazil, you find that they had over 377,000 agents in 2015, whilst India had 500,000 in 2018. Nigeria, by the last data we had in 2017, which was in December, we had barely 18,228 agents. And that was prior to the SANEF policy that was launched by CBN in 2018. So fast forward to 2020, August, we have currently 418,000 agents and still counting. And like I said, thanks to SANEF and CBN, and not forgetting the banking community and ourselves, NIPS. This was quite deliberate and intentional. And if you can see, we have the EFINA data in the next slide. It kind of speaks to where we were in terms of exclusion and inclusion. So you find that 36.8% of the 99.6 million adult population were financially excluded by December 2018. But if you go to the next slide, you'll be seeing the journey of transformation, what we had to do over time. There were salient milestones and enabled clearly by the Central Bank of Nigeria. We had in 2010 had introduced the mobile money to include unbanked population. We had in 2013 introduced the agent banking as a delivery channel. And we had to look at the 2018, which was the breaking point, that we had to release a National Financial Inclusion Strategy revised document, and of course the SANEF was created. If you look at what has happened in the last 2 years, we can see a huge jump from where we were and from where we are today. And this is more because if you look at the BVN data, by the time of 2018, we were on 36 million BVN registered Nigerians. And by 2020, we are currently on 43 million. That, all of it being said, it's more because there was this strategy by the Central Bank of Nigeria who focused clearly on carrying the community along. It was very clear, very apt, timely. And so far, we have noticed that with a lot of collaboration in the ecosystem, there's been so much going on. And the last, not the least, the very recent introduction of PSBs, just like we had in India, payment service banks. So they have just been issued their formal licenses, and we're hoping that there will be further improvement in the financial inclusion space in Nigeria. Thank you.
Christabel, fantastic. I'm very surprised to see that in a period of 3 years, your agent network has exploded. It's 418,000. You reached, I mean, are we expecting that the financial inclusion will start accelerating after that, now that the agent network is in place? Or what's driving this? Is there a commercial business model that these agents are being incentivized to enter this market? I mean, this is a large increase in 3 years.
Okay, one of the biggest enablers were introduced by Central Bank again. The governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria last year, 2019, came up with a 5-year policy that spoke to the fact that we must have like 100 million BVN by the year 2024, a 95% financial inclusion rate. And lastly, that by this year, we should come up with 500,000 agents. So the push between last year and this year was more from that mandate by central bank. So creating the SANEF was what pushed the numbers forward. And again, maybe you can talk about commercial. There is a commercial incentive around it. CBN had reduced the MSC charge from 0.75 to 0.5%, creating a very special MCC line for agents, so that, again, clearly to reduce their cash in, cash out charges. So we have a lot of things going on, and it's still an ongoing journey. Thank you.
And going to a BVN, 100 million people for 2024, will the agents be the ones conducting the enrollment for the BVN? Would that be how you're going to get there by 2024?
It's a mix, because the agents, the banks, of course, we have the biggest involvement of the NIMC leg of it, because we're talking about national identity here and bank verification number. So there will be a lot of agents out there that can do this, which is why I mentioned the PSBs. So I believe that if we are able to work together, we should be able to achieve that number. Yes.
Okay. So we're going to talk about that next week between the central bank and then NIMC, how these two agencies are going to be able to leverage their agent network and their enrollment capability in order to arrive at a large, ambitious number of inclusive and coverage. Okay, so clearly the story in the BVN is a positive story. You've made a lot of progress. Right now, what would you say the biggest barrier for those people who want to be financially included is? Right now, why aren't everybody who's an adult having a BVN number?
I think when Dr. spoke, he spoke about challenges and barriers. And I take it's not so different from one country to another. The biggest, usually we say, is access to finance. The access, because in this part of the world, we're talking about economic inclusion. Right. Most of the time, you find that a lot of people don't even have enough to eat, more so to begin to register for some identity. So they rather have the money than have anything identity. So I believe that the barrier on access is major. And if you look at it, it's something that the federal government, again, can support to actualize it for the community. Yes.
Okay. So basically, in some cases, the demand may not be there. Somebody's saying, look, I am in a situation where I'd rather keep my money and use it to buy food instead of go and register and get a BVN. It's not there yet compelling in their education level to say this is something that you need to have in order to function. Would I be correct in saying that the demand is also not as strong?
The demand is one, the financial literacy is another, because the literacy aspect of it is the awareness. What's the need for me? I'm almost certain that from what the banks are doing right now, a lot of them are coming in. Agent locations, really, currently we have in all the 774 local government areas of Nigeria. So you find that if you're easily able to access your finance, whereby you can do your day-to-day payments, they're able to register more. So we're having that enabled. Accounts are being opened at that touch point. So it's only when it's enabled from the federal government perspective that we can have that push.
Okay, so I wanna move on to Barry and basically understand from his perspective what are the barriers to financial inclusion in Africa and how those could be eased up. But while Barry is setting his thoughts up, I want to share with you a question, and then I'll come back to you, Cristobal, to answer that question. Maybe other panelists could join in that. And the question was, countries like Nigeria tend to be excluded from economic advantages of generating income for their citizens via services like PayPal. You can spend through PayPal, but cannot receive payment. Identity verification of Nigerian users and fraud is often cited as reason. Cannot the use of verifiable digital ID, such as the NIN, be used to allow such financial inclusion online? It would be easier than requiring scanned copies of plastic ID cards and selfies as required by online services like Uber. So, Cristobal, I'll leave you to compose your thoughts about this, and anybody else who wants to join that will come back after Barry gives his perspective on his spotlight on financial inclusion in Africa. Okay, Barry?
Thank you, Dr. Atik. So in all our studies in financial inclusion, one of the biggest and the most stubborn barriers is this issue of lack of documentation. And you can see it's pervasive across the entire continent. And when you draw down and to see what this lack of documentation is, it's often people with an ID, but they don't have the other requisite documentation, or people with some documentation and not an ID. So it's across the board, and it's in every country. And it was odd for us to say, why is it physical documentation that is such a barrier? And then what we found is that there was a requirement for physical documentation like proof of address, physical ID to see the ID, and also face-to-face customer onboarding. Even where there was digital ID, you need face-to-face customer onboarding. And this is an enormous barrier to inclusive financial integrity. From the perspective of financial inclusion, many people in Africa do not have the documentation needed to open an account. So those will be over and above those that are currently listed. At a formal financial institution, or sign up for digital payment options like mobile money, e-money, and consequently they are by rule excluded from the financial services. Now just let that sink in. What you're doing here is you're separating a population, and you are actively discriminating and reinforcing inequality in a population by eliminating people out of the financial system, and also out of the economic inclusion possibilities. But those people don't just sit back and take this. What they do is they involve themselves in illicit and sometimes informal financial services. And that's a bigger problem, because those informal financial services, I'm not saying all informal financial services are bad, but a lot of them link into illicit financial services and illicit flows. And our research into illicit flows indicates that in some jurisdictions, up to 10% of GDP is siphoned out of a country, is extracted. So you've got this position where you really need to protect the integrity of these financial systems. But at the other hand, you can't do it at the cost of people not being included. So you have to work on both ends. You have to protect the integrity, and you have to include people to make a much more vibrant economy. So in drilling down into this problem, we looked at it from at the global standards level, the regional FATF style bodies, and also the regulators, and then down to the institutions, to really understand what is in place. And from at the global standards and even at the regional bodies, there seems to be a relative equality in view that this should not be an issue, and they're correct. The FATF standards are really quite they're quite progressive in allowing people into the financial system. In fact, that they acknowledge that excluding people is a risk. If we go to the next one. So what we did was we looked at an institutional level, what's happening at the institutional level. And often we found that the laws in countries are sometimes to blame, sometimes the regulators, but often at the institutional levels to blame. So we looked at what is the impact and the current compliance modality in those financial institutions. We looked at six of them, and this is an average representation of what's happening there. So the first thing that really was noteworthy is that none of these financial institutions actually tracked the cost of compliance. They didn't actually track to see what's pushing up my costs, how much am I spending on compliance, and why am I doing this, and why am I excluding people? And if you have a look at the predominant driver is due diligence. So this is getting people into the system, onboarding into the system, and maintaining them on the system. And of those, you can see that the biggest portion there is staff costs. And that's because you need people in various locations, interviewing people, getting physical documents, and the logistics around those physical documents. So that's a big cost. And you have to say, well, to what end? And that I think is the key question. When you look at why they do this, it's because they are aligned with this KYC approach. So KYC is very, it's not well defined. It's a business regulatory or supervisory concept. And what the KYC approach looks at is saying, what to comply? What is my risk as a business? My risk as a business is that I'll get compliance fines. So the whole thing is staged around compliance. What can I do to demonstrate that I'm complying? I can collect a whole lot of documents and I can tick them off. And hopefully my collection of artifacts will translate somehow into money laundering risk. Or reduction in money laundering risk, and that is the position. I mean, this should have been over with more than a decade ago. So what we're seeing now is that you've got very high costs of compliance, and that translates directly into the financial services that can be offered. Even people with identities often cannot access those services because either they're too far away, or and the costs are prohibitive for the consumer because they have to either miss a day's wages or production, high transport costs, and inevitably it's more than one trip because they don't have all the other paraphernalia that you need to put into it. And we looked at it and said, well, what is actually necessary to overcome these barriers? And it's not all these artifacts that they require. What's actually necessary is a digital identity and a verifiable, a unique and verifiable identity, and that's it. All this other paraphernalia like proof of address does very little. These things have got very limited veracity. They're paper documents. They're easy to falsify, and you're going to place reliance on them. I mean, yeah. So with proof of address, it seems to be pervasive as a requirement. They're using proof of address as an identifier, probably regarded more highly than a very good biometric. So it's an odd situation where you've got it's almost like in the context, it's like identifying the passengers on the bus by the bus registration number. It's of very little consequence. And so we're looking at moving towards, and a lot of countries and institutions are moving towards digital identity, because with digital, what you do is you break those bonds of logistics. You don't have to have people in many branches. Your logistic costs shrinks. Your potential customer base increases both geographically and also in terms of affordability. You can't offer a $10 or $20 savings account, which is meaningful for many people. You can't offer that if your compliance cost is $10 or $20 for the savings account, and irrespective of that. So irrespective of whether they have the requisite identity or not. So for us, this is a big issue. Moving to digital really shaves down the costs, increases the market potential, and also in moving into an identity proofing scheme in line with the FATF's recommendations on digital identity and identity proofing, stops us from going into this KYC type of initiative. KYC, we see it as almost like a turnstile where you need a whole lot of artifacts in order to be allowed into an arena. And then once you're in the arena, let's hope you do good. Whereas in digital identity, it's more of a highway where people come in, identifiers are attached to them, and in time, those identifiers are linked with the behavior. We've got a much robust profile of this customer. We understand the risk of this customer and the exposure of the system to the customer. And what that does is it enables us to, on the first hand, to protect the system from abuse, but also to open up the other end and also allow people into the system that don't necessarily have a formal ID or a foundational ID. It allows that flexibility, and this is absolutely in line with the FATF's guidance. It's just so difficult to get this into cultures, particularly where there's these zero tolerance approaches and fines and often built into laws. We're currently rewriting some of the laws in the continent to enable this.
So Barry, yeah, you have another slide?
No, that was it.
Great. So actually, this is a very, very important point that you're raising, which is basically a barrier to inclusion is compliance. And so we need to reform the compliance laws. We need to adapt to the digital age. The digital age is allowing us to create a partnership between the banking, the central bank, and between the identity authorities in order to help each other. The central bank wants financial inclusion. The identity authorities wants inclusion of people in their ID domain. And therefore, there's a real opportunity. Let's get away from KYC, the old ways of doing business, and let's embrace a more modern digital way, which can help the inclusion. We'll revisit that subject in the call for action. But I want to go back to Cristobal and see what's your position on the question that I've just raised. Barry, thank you for this insight. Really, really tremendous.
Can you repeat your question again, Joseph, please?
Yeah, I mean, basically what they're saying is that they cannot receive money with PayPal because the banks say that there is fraud in Nigeria. They use PayPal as an example. Are we going to link basically payment services at some point through a verifiable NIN or a verifiable BVN, and therefore allow people to receive and send money through PayPal, for example, without the risk of being told because of fraud, we're shutting down this payment service?
Okay. I want to believe that for most of the parties that want to participate in the Nigerian payment space, you have to be admitted as part of the ecosystem. So currently today, we actually give access to parties like banks and those who have licenses from Central Bank of Nigeria. So in our ecosystem, third parties are admitted for those who have licenses from Central Bank of Nigeria. So PayPal is a foreign company in this case. So clearly for us to begin to open access, I'm sure everybody understands the sensitivity of the identity of the customer. So we're currently reviewing a document on data protection bill by the federal government, and clearly tends to protect the consumer rights around the consent prior to any access to their data. So I'm not sure that as we sit now that we're able to do that, but I'm sure with the conjecture with partnership with NIMSI and all, that we will certainly get there. Again, today in Nigeria, we have APIs, BVN APIs that are open, that again, if you're able to consume that, then you can be able to have that data maybe for one validation or the other. But to open it up to just everybody is not in place right now. Thank you.
And that's the reason the identity verification is not open to, say, a party like PayPal to do that. And therefore, over time, you're going to be assessing. Technologically, you can do it. It's just from a regulation point of view, it's not been done. Okay. Now I want to go back to the technology platform. We talked about policies, we talked about practices. I want to talk with Joan Dubois from Thales and then GSMA, which are both technologists. They have platforms. And I'd like to understand how can technology alleviate the inclusion challenge in advanced countries, especially in an affordable manner. So, John?
Hello. I wish to all a wonderful Identity Day first. And thank you, Joseph, for allowing me to take part to this awareness session. And I will focus about the inclusive registration. we know as identity system provider how to handle large registration campaign of identities. We've made that very often around the countries using either online mechanism or offline mechanism. But the challenge comes when you have to register the last mile people, the ones that you're never able to register. Can I have the slides? Okay, and go on to slide 2, please. Okay. So finally, having an inclusive registration is about succeeding in registering the unregistered people. And for that, you need to solve the reason for their unregistration. If you have a look to the barriers to registration, there are many, and it will be difficult really to address them all. But fortunately, it's possible to group them in categories and then to address those categories. Next, please. So on our side, we have explored those reasons during trips that we have made to Cameroon and Burkina Faso, which have allowed us to discover and categorize them more. This is, by the way, part of 3 articles that we are releasing following our statement paper on unique identity. And I take the opportunity to thank the host that welcomed us in those 2 countries. Briefly, what we have discovered, we can see 3 kinds of categories. First is the lack of access. First, because of some too restrictive rules preventing for registration. Often also there is a physical distance up to the registration place and maybe the related expense that will go with it. Then we can see also, it was already mentioned by the panelists, the lack of awareness. Most of people don't know the rules that they need to register, don't really understand the benefits or don't know it. And also the importance to register their child from the beginning, what it will be enabling for them later. And also illettrism, which is leading maybe some people to don't understand, for example, in a birth declaration, that the birth certificate given by the doctor is not, in fact, the civil registration birth certificate. Finally, we have mentioned also some barriers from society barriers coming from culture, family, religion, leading to some fear finally to register. Okay, so as we see, the barrier can be many, so the solution cannot be unique. And finally, it's important to come with a portfolio of solutions which are adapted to the different categories of people living in urban area, living in communities, being children or women. So what we can propose first is to reverse the process. Don't expect the people to come to register. Try to register in the place where the events happen. For example, in health center, in village, in market. When registering birth or death, going to the hospital, going to, I said, the market, try to target some specific populations that are under-registered, like children, women, or small community. Don't expect the whole population to be aware and to understand the importance of registration. Yeah. Also, prefer a lightweight device, for example, the tablets or mobile-based device in order to ease the move of registration towards the people and address the communities. I'm still on this slide. So for example, you can propose to have an efficient fixed registration in the place where there are a lot of persons and where there is a connectivity available. You can move some enrollment kits to the place where there are significant amount of people and so perform large registration campaign and keep the capability with some small factor device like smartphones, like tablets for small community. Try to invent with frugal innovation to do more with less, like it is used to be done in the developing country. Important also is to optimize the usage of the equipment, not try to do a massive, but try to do a cartography, carefully analyze the population and prepare the registration. Not try to manage the peak, but try to manage the recurrent registration needs by having a regional approach. And finally, monitor the registration so that you can adapt for example, the behavior of the operators in case they don't properly register. Try to have live feedbacks so that you can correct if needed. Next. And the last point is about the permissive approach. So an inclusive registration must not have any rule other than the biometrics unicity, no criteria. The criteria have to be applied and the eligibility have to be applied at the service level when you use the identity, but not at the registration. That's a key for inclusion. No exclusion on gender. The goal is to just to acknowledge the existence of people in those systems, and the service delivery will take care to see the eligibility. Also, it's important to not reject registration because of incomplete data. An incomplete identity will be a real identity if biometrically okay, even in the absence of a birth certificate or some information about the person. Okay, so finally, to conclude on the last slide, we can see the demand is high and the solution exists, and the government are ready to go with the help of the development agencies. So in order to go to inclusive registration, we need to reverse the process, multiply the registration channel, and use a permissive approach. It's important to put in place continuous registration, not just one time. And of course, make sure that the system are secure and the privacy is protected. With all that, we can hope that we can reach 100% inclusive registration of identity, which are trusted.
Great. John, does the industry have a hybrid approach to registration where, for example, you can allow people to register self-registration through their mobile phones, in which case this incomplete data, they provide certain types of biometric data, but not the ones that you can capture from an enrollment center, etc. And yet you can still result in a registration record or a ID record. But is the industry developing hybrid approaches to registration in order to allow basically open door, let's get people in, and then over time, we can improve the data that we have. Is this happening? If it's happening, where is this happening?
Okay, yes, it's happening definitely in two domains. First, in the unique identity registration, the foundational ID. For example, Philippines are planning to do a pre-registration of information using some small factor device. And after all, invite the people to go to a registration center to capture the biometrics, maybe scan the breeder documents. Moreover, in the civil registration, in the modern civil registration about birth and death, there is no complete information which is captured at the moment of the registration. And we have some example where we can see using smartphone, you can already declare a birth, create a unique number, and you will verify the evidence. You will see the parent afterward, but the registration is made and it's made live. So it's a good benefit for completeness of the registration.
Okay, so it's basically it's not going to be one size enrollment kit that will fit all. There will be many types of enrollment capture devices, capture sources of data, etc. And that eventually the vetting process and the data analytics has to be sophisticated enough to attribute a trust value depending on the quality of the data. Yes. Is this
Is this, and the first thing is to acknowledge the existence of the person very quickly, and after verify maybe the attributes, the names, the birth dates, have the evidence, but acknowledge the first thing for inclusion.
Okay, great. I mean, technology is clearly not the silver bullet, but it does help if you have powerful technologies to move this process forward. Speaking of platforms of technology, I want to see what the mobile operators, what GSMA thinks they can contribute in terms of solving this inclusion challenge. Ken, could you please join us?
Yes, thank you again. First of all, I just want to mention that about a few statistics, just before I go into the details, that 5.2 billion people at the moment, or as at end of 2017, as at the end of 2019, are connected to the mobile services. And this already shows just the reach and the scale and the integration of this technology, which is in the hands of the people. And it's against this that we are building our initiatives just to address what has proven to be inclusive in our view. So look at just the slide that has just been brought up. This is just the global Findex data against the unique mobile subscription across many countries. And it shows us one thing. It's just the link that it presents between the unique mobile subscription and the ID penetration in these countries. The former driving the ID registration or penetration. And this is just an illustration of the relationship between the ID coverage and the mobile penetration across these countries. These are countries that mandate SIM registration as a requirement to enable SIM-enabled services. So even if you look at the blue line and then I give you one case, take a case of Malawi, with 15% of the population with ID and 32% of the population with the unique mobile subscription. The question is, can we leverage mobile network operators' infrastructure to bridge this gap? And considering Malawi population of around 18 million or thereabouts, then the mobile technology then holds the potential of impacting the lives of around 1.5 million people in helping bridge this gap. But just try to bring up the next slide. Yeah, this presents another value that we found in the business assets of the mobile network operators that can be leveraged to drive inclusion. One side addresses the supply side challenges, while the other side is the demand side challenges. And the supply side challenges, you can see the extensive networks of agents, established privacy practices, given they hold the customer data, the personal data, and the experience in managing the customer personal data. These are some of the efforts or some of the assets that we feel and believe that could be leveraged to complement government efforts to improve access or even accelerate enrollment foundational ID schemes. And looking at even the other side of the demand, it also gives a representation of the degree to which government and businesses have been digitized to create a pool for adoption of and usage of these IDs. For instance, access to ID-linked e-government services or social protection grants. This is a case of the way government works, the government 3.0, aiming at providing data-driven decision-making based on the data that they already hold, even about the citizens of that country. And a practical case is just the case of the Federal Republic of Nigeria that has been mentioned, with a population of, again, close to 200 million. We've helped actually broker even the relationship between the private sector, particularly the mobile network operators, to convene with governments and agree to partner with a view to accelerating enrollment into the country's digital ID ecosystem, leveraging on these assets that I've mentioned. And again, I want to bring you to the case of Tanzania again, where mobile-enabled digital birth registration projects have collectively registered the births of over 4 million since 2013. And this is a potential that we also see in the mobile platform, just because of its reach, operator assets, and even they are agents in dealing with customer or personal related data. And this has helped government facilitate rollout of digital IDs. Again, to unlock the potential or the opportunities in this new economy, identity assurance is also key. And mobile network operators have had the potential to offer this verification platform to unlock access to this wealth of services or online services that can be accessed on a mobile platform. For instance, look at the mobile network operators that hold personal data assets, customer attributes, network mobility data, and even other KYC related data. This is a key in improving the level of identity insurance and can support the development of functional identities that have the potential again to unlock access to certain other services, like even ID-linked services in the educational sector, in the health sector. And think about even of improving the creditworthiness of an individual based on mobile money transactional history, or even subsequent access to credit. And just some case study. In 2018, again, we documented innovative cases in the Caribbean and the Burkina Faso. And these are startups, again, leveraging mobile technology to establish functional and foundational identities. And this could be developed to provide people with further access even to other services. The details of this, again, is available online, but all are around the assets that the mobile network, the assets and the infrastructure of the mobile network operators. And to tie that point even to the current pandemic, COVID-19 has impacted our lives again in profound ways, including the way we use our mobile phones. And these are, again, has also brought sharp focus on the effective digital ID platform. And remote access to systems and even services has even become more in demand. And therefore, it's another area that means that there is need for secure and safe authentication that can only be done remotely, but based on this mobile network platform. Of course, all these also require supportive policies and regulatory frameworks, which again, I just want to share briefly. And we focus this actually along 3 key objectives. No, it's not on the last slide. There's actually need for an environment that accelerates enrollment of this underserved on these foundational digital ID platforms. And there is also a need for development of mobile-enabled services that can drive demand for this ID. And this actually focuses on the demand side of the slide that actually is being presented there. But beyond that, there's also need for the conducive regulatory framework to support these inclusive ID systems via mobile. For example, look at the proof of identity that is actually mandatory for SIM registration. There's need for policies that must be proportionate to the market context. And this is where we ask the question, what is actually proportionate to ask for? And what we talk about is it should be a policy that takes into account identity penetration, the cost, and ease of access of this. And this has also to take care of the gender disparities that exist in the market. But more important is also the development of frameworks around the privacy and data protection, which is also key just because of the personal data that is actually handled by these platforms in this new economy. And this brings me to the next slide on, that is titled Trust. Trust is actually key. Sorry. Trust is actually key, especially if end users are to volunteer part of their personal data that actually constitutes the identity. Look at the slide that is actually being projected. As at March 2020, only 59% of the countries requiring an ID to access ID-linked services, such as mobile, had a robust data privacy framework in effect. And therefore, we also encourage that even as we use mobile as a platform for identity, we encourage best practices around that consumer protection or privacy practices, as well as sectoral practices on handling customer data, because this is actually what constitutes a personal identity and must be aligned with the consumer expectations so that it's more inclusive and takes care of the interests of the consumers. Having this framework actually in place would not only encourage adoption of these ID-linked services, but also provide clarity on each of these parties' role around personal data that actually sits as KYC data on these mobile platforms. Again, beyond that, it builds confidence and drives the adoption.
Thanks.
Yes.
Can you wrap up, please, Ken?
Yes, I just want to mention about something a bit about the one use case around digital birth registration. And this is where when we started, we began tracking and reporting a number of mobile-enabled digital birth registration initiatives supported by mobile operators in Tanzania, Senegal, and even Ghana. We documented some lessons in 2 reports that I want to cite here, the birth registration in Tanzania. As of 2019, again, leveraging on the mobile platform just because of the reach, access, and even integration in people's lives, over 3.6 million children under the age of 5 have been registered and issued with birth certificate under this initiative as of mid of 2019. And we are looking at having around 1 million more children under this initiative registered by end of 2020. Again, this leverages just on the extent of penetration of mobile technology into the community, and even the experience of agents of mobile networks handling customer data, their connection with the community, even as they collect their personal data.
Okay, thank you so much. It's clear that the mobile platform is a gateway to identity inclusion, and therefore there's going to be more synergies between the two. So we're glad to have you with us. I want to ask all the panelists to compose their thoughts if they have anything regarding calls for action, because we're going to come back to that. But I want to spend some time with Namati, with Mustafa Mahmoud, because I know Mustafa is itching and he wants to really come in and say, you know, all this well and good, but there is something fundamentally missing from this discussion. So I go to Namati and say, Mustafa, what are we doing that is not right? And what do we need to do in order to bring both sides so that the critics of ID systems realize that this is for the public good, and those who are very much enthusiastic about ID systems understand that we cannot ignore certain legitimate concerns that continue to linger. So while you can phrase that, the panelists will think about calls for action.
Thank you, Joseph. I'd like to begin by stating that I believe that it's not in the interest of the service providers, solution providers, to create solutions that will be used to discriminate against individuals. Nor it is in the interest of the donor communities to fund projects that will be used to discriminate against minorities and marginalized. So since it's not in their interest, I think it will be best for even solution providers to have a budgetary allocation for civil societies that are doing monitoring around issues of identity programs around the world. Because, for example, just a half an hour ago, the Ministry of Information was just sharing that they've been able to register around 37 million people in the new digital ID system, but they've been able to just merge 14 million individuals into the new database because they're trying to make a centralized database. Now, the question is, why is it that such errors, if you look at 37 people registered and only 14 million people were able to be merged into a register, why are they happening? It's because we have a failed system in existence that we've not addressed these problems before going to a new system. For example, the current ID card system that we have, and Ken can bear witness to this, as service providers of mobile, they've been able to see that one ID number has been used by like 5 people. So if you look at the margin of error where one ID number can be used by 5 people, and you're going to bring a new identity system requiring the same ID number to enroll into a new system, it beats the purpose. I think the biggest problem is that whenever we're designing an identity system, we don't do a human-centered approach in terms of policy and systems design. Because, for example, a good example also goes to when you want to register as stateless people, because the Kenya Constitution allows us to register stateless people. But unfortunately, we have the law in place. But when it comes to the practice, it says that for you to register as a stateless person, you have to register online on a platform that is called FNS. For you to register on that platform, you need either a valid passport or a valid identity document. Now, the practical bit is, for a stateless person, he does not have a valid passport. He does not have a valid ID. So it means you have given him the room to apply for something, but you've locked him again because you have a prerequisite that he does not have. So our approach is basically, we need to have systems in place that can help communities enroll. And our approach as Namati is the legal empowerment approach, whereby when you talk about legal empowerment, we look at empowering communities to know the law, know the procedures of enrollment. And then once they know these things, we work with the paralegals to help them enroll into these systems. Because we believe that, in several researches that by just someone working a process with you, the journey becomes shorter. Because these are communities that have been marginalized for years and years and years. Some have even given up on the process. So basically, we look at paralegal approaches at boosting the registrations in these countries like Kenya. And I like one question that Christoph had asked in the chat, where he was asking the comparison where countries are reporting that they have 100% registration rate. And the question is, if you are the person registering, how do you even do an evaluation of your own system and say we have 100% registration? We need to have a shadow mechanism whereby even civil societies could be able to come and say, based on our research and based on our groundwork, this is the statistics that is accurate. For example, the country in Kenya again, where we said we had 90% registration for the Huduma number, we are still alive to the fact that over 5 million people have to go through differential treatment to enroll into an identity system. And we're saying 90%. Still going back to Christoph's point of being alive to the fact that we have pastoralist communities that basically might have migrated from the area that you are going to register. So it means we've left them out. How do we assure the people that these people are included, especially for rolling out such initiative? And another thing that I wanted to highlight is Ken mentioned about the ID penetration also. We are also alive to the fact that there are issues of geographical marginalization, whereby there's one registration center serving a very big geographical space. And we look at the cost of getting an identity could be as much as we say that an ID is free, but the cost of applying for an ID in places like Kwale, which is in the coast, it could go up to 2,000 shillings because of transportation, because the center is very far. When I say 2,000 shillings, I mean $20. So as much as we're saying it's free, there's a cost in it because the access to the registration center is an impediment. So as service providers, we should look at how do we encourage governments to have an inclusive identity system that is alive to the fact that women are marginalized, geographical marginalization exists. And another aspect that is very important, if you have design, human interest, human-centered design, you realize that there are people who suffer from hypersweating, where the fingerprints sometimes cannot appear because their hands are too, they've sweated a lot. We have issues of eczema and the rest, and even in countries where we have, like Kenya, where people do a lot of hard labor, the fingerprints corrode. So if we look at the reality on the ground, we'll develop systems that work for people. So if we factor in individuals into the system design, into the policy design, we can be able to have an inclusive identity system.
Okay, so factor people in the design of your program. That's an important point. Actually, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give every single panelist just 1 or 2 minutes to talk about final thoughts or calls for action if you have one. And then I think I have somebody from the community voice that wants to get on. We'll get them on before we end the session. Alan, I was very intrigued by your last slide, and it leads to a natural call for action, which is the notion that just like privacy impact assessments, should we be developing what we would call exclusion risk assessments, which is a domain that we are not yet familiar with as a community. What are your thoughts about that? How can you shape that into a call for action?
Well, Joseph, yes. I mean, I think that the concept of a privacy risk assessment is a very well-established concept. And one of the reasons is that the privacy issue affects everybody. It includes powerful people, it includes commercial interests. And so it's something that the world community has rallied around. The issue for inclusion is that it is many different facets, and it affects usually the least powerful people and the most marginalized groups. And that makes it different. And for that reason, I think it would be a good idea to reinforce the process on inclusion. It's a reinforcing process. It's not something that isn't done now, but I think that process could be reinforced to have a more systematic approach, including many of the points that have been raised about the ground up process, the views from NGOs and civil society organizations. I think this point about the alternative view, the fact that it's not just simply an official number, but it's something coming from the society that needs to be factored in as a way of looking at these barriers and reducing them. And then, as I said, I would like to see that tied into the whole incentive question. Inclusion is expensive at the margin. Reaching that last mile can be costly, and we have to recognize that and build it in. And again, public information. So those are some of the thoughts on my mind.
But would you think that this is something that is worth developing from the think tanks, developing a domain which we would call exclusion risk assessment or exclusion impact assessment, because privacy impact assessment is now well developed, established after many, many years of people knowing. There are even checklists. You can say, this is what I do. Is this something that you think the community should collectively be working on to produce a guidance on the subject?
Yes, I think it would be very useful. I think we know enough about the factors to be able to shape such an assessment. And in fact, there are elements of this that are done already, Joseph. So it's not that it's something completely new. But I think that institutionalizing it in this way and bringing together some of these different facets so that we're not just looking at one or other aspect, we're trying to look at them together from the society point of view. I think that would be a positive step forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Alan, for your contribution. Tariq, can you give your closing thoughts?
Yes, I'll go back to the social contract, theme. And I would say that, it's very important that when you architecture the ID application or a program, the legal framework is very important because it's a social contract. That is, a contract is a legal thing. So have your representatives in the parliament debate about the inclusion part also, so that nobody is left behind. Then what Mustafa said is very important, that role of CSOs, NGOs, and not only that, international organization who protect the civil society right, that nobody is excluded, number two. Number three, then what you mentioned, and I think Ken and Dubios have also mentioned, the ID system should be designed to introduce flexibility to enroll the people upfront with minimal criteria, and then do in-depth analytics at the background regarding credentials of ID verification documents. Use the technologies to register the uniqueness or unique attributes of the citizen, and that becomes the key identity. And rest of the documents or the verification, or identity level assurance, as we say, comes next. And you can first include everybody and then use the criteria to see that the identity assurance level is increasing or not, so that everybody is counted. It is important that the state counts all the people so that the people can count on the state. It's a two-way process. You can enhance state capacity, and but ensure that state doesn't become big brother to exclude anybody.
Okay, thank you, Tariq. Thank you for your contribution. Christabel, your closing thoughts.
Thank you, Joseph. I would say that for Nigeria, I believe from where we sit, it's simply about closing the gap. If my last comment was the BVN was to protect the customers' account, bank customers, from unauthorized access. And has this been achieved? Likely yes, but to 43 million Nigerians. If we have the gap of 99.6, the call to action will therefore be that the priority will be to achieve digital identity for the remaining adult population. That's critical. Then again, on the economic inclusion, that we should be able to put up incentives. That alone can be telephones, can be funds, but like the palliatives as we know it, cash transfers and all of that can help to move the traction forward. Then we can continue on the products, that to be able to avail the agents and customers more products that are easier to access and of course cheaper. That way we'll be having the ecosystem talk in one shape. And lastly, for me, will be the collaboration. We're in a complex environment, and there should be more intensive collaboration, discussions, alignment, and focused action to achieve timelines based on what we are and where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution, Cristobal. Barry, I was intrigued by your message, which was basically reform compliance. Compliance is a major barrier, and we see it. We see it even in developing countries. It's gotten even worse and worse and worse. Many of the banks are actually rejecting people and looking for high net worth individual because the cost of maintaining the low level bank accounts has become very prohibitive, let alone in developing countries. So what do we do? I mean, what is the call for action when we say, wake up, we need to reform the compliance for KYC. So what is Sentry doing in that regard, and what others are doing to solve this issue? To me, I think this is one of those criteria which, if you solve it, it can open up a wide floodgate.
Yeah, from our work with the UN remittances task force, what we're finding is that this inertia to digitalization has gone with COVID-19. The market shifted, and digitalization is what the market requires. So I think it's exactly the time now to start embracing things like digital identity proofing, digital identity guidance from the FATF, and moving towards a more inclusive system and a stronger system. I think if you hear KYC, then you just need to understand that this is a very, very compliance-orientated, but not an outcomes-orientated view. And I think moving away from KYC to digital ID proofing, I think will open up immeasurable benefits. But not only that, it'll give a lot more utility to an ID that exists, and it'll give a lot more functionality to somebody that doesn't have an ID on the journey of creating ID.
Excellent words of wisdom, Barry. Really, thank you for your contribution. John, to you.
Thank you, Joseph. So I will have two reflections to conclude. The first one is about, so identity is moving to digital, and the identity registration is to move to digital too. But the infrastructure are not yet there. So we need to think out of the box to reuse as much as we can the identity assets that we can have in countries. Also think with a frugal innovation, try to do more with less from now so that we can accelerate. Second point, we need to be careful because the value of identity is going to increase with all this usage and services that we have. The trust level needs to keep very high in order to keep the whole value of identity and not have the identity system to collapse. So what's important is to secure the data during the registration, ensure the unicity, the uniqueness of the identities in system, and also protect the privacy when talking about usage.
Excellent. Thank you, John, for your contribution. Ken, it's to you.
Yes, reflecting on the insights over the years, we are focusing now on addressing specific identity challenges where mobile platforms can drive this inclusion. But we are looking at inclusion that is socially impactful, but also sustainable. So that means there would be high demand for building capacities of these governments, especially the ones that implement foundational IDs. And that would focus on the role of PPPs, public-private partnership, and how technologies with such scales in terms of reach could be used to create accessible and inclusive digital IDs. But to make this successful, again, you'd expect or continue to exploring ways to work with commercial partners to to advance a shared view in terms of the key principles underpinning digital identity, educating the policymakers in building these schemes. Therefore, ours is to call upon policymakers represented here to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to us as GSMA, so that together we can explore this through training or building capacities of policymakers to create inclusive ID scheme that also address the unique characteristics of the vulnerable populations that we are talking about.
This is a great point. So, I mean, rephrasing it, I would say any government that is planning on launching ID systems, I think they should be thinking about them from the beginning within the context of a PPP, or at least certain aspects of the program. That collaboration can bring significant amount of value to the table. And I think a PPP as a default starting point might be a useful framework for adopting for the ID development. Thank you for your contribution. Thanks to GSMA for making yourselves available with us. Namati, Mustafa, please, your quick closing points.
Well, thank you very much. For us to achieve an inclusive, transparent identity system, we need to have stakeholders like civil societies and international organizations more into this sector. And for them to be active into this sector, we also need to increase the funding into this sector, because we do a lot of funding in other areas like land matters, economic matters, but we forget that an identity is the gateway to accessing all these areas. It's the gate pass to having rights, and it's the gate pass to your mere existence. So basically, the donor community must increase funding in this area. And also, as service providers, as solution providers, we should get out of the cocoon of thinking of the end user as the corporates. We should think as the end user as the person at the end of that card, the individual owning that card. If we think of the end user as the owner of that card, we'll be able to look at how will this individual be able to enroll. So if we focus on enrollment and inclusivity, we can be able to have better inclusive system. That's my take.
Okay. Enrollment and inclusivity starts with enrollment. That's a resonance. Thank you very much. Actually, I want to bring in whoever is raised their hands from the community voices. I don't know who it is. Operator, could you please bring the person from the community voice so we can end the session, but I don't want to not have community voices. Let's see who's coming on. Let's see, is there somebody? Oh, Ed. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Joseph. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity at the end of this meeting, and great conversation, and very happy International Identity Day, everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity right at the end to circle back to something that Alan mentioned at the beginning, which I think is really important, and to emphasize it a little bit. And in general, I think there is a lack of recognition of the role that civil registration can play when it comes to inclusion. Generally, in some of the presentations and elsewhere, I've seen that when we're speaking about inclusion, for example, for a national enrollment program, it's all about percentage coverage and how can we drive up the coverage. But I think also to echo what Mustafa was saying, it's about individuals and human beings, and it matters which individuals are being left behind. So if you imagine, very briefly, a national enrollment program for ID, which is linked to new social protection and financial inclusion initiatives in a country, clearly the ID can give a uniqueness, that sense of uniqueness. But how do you know who has enrolled individually? How do you know who has been excluded? And there, I think civil registration is the key, because civil registration is a sole continuous source of population data, and can provide the universal data set from which we can understand who is included and not. So in addition to what Alan mentioned in terms of better integration with civil registration, it's more universal civil registration, which will allow it to to play a primary role in terms of the inclusion mechanisms for ID systems and beyond. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent point. And I think civil registration provides the ground truth against which we can measure the progress of ID systems. What I'd like to do is ceremonially end this session with us saying goodbye to the attendees. There will be please play the background music. In the meantime, we will be doing Nigeria Spotlight. So thank you very much for your time for this session. Clearly, this is a very, very complex topic. I hope we shut up, but we will continue this discussion. Thank you.
Bye.
Africa Mukai.